What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, we talked to a guest. His name is Jim Ambuske. And Jim knows everything, we'll say Revolutionary War and Civil War related.
So he's actually a historian of the American Revolution, Scotland, which we didn't really touch on at all, and the British Atlantic world. And on top of that, he leads the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library. So he's a guy who knows a thing or two about American history.
We find out that Jerry's history needs a little brush up. Mine's probably needs a brush up too.
Yeah. And I'd imagine that, like most Americans, my history lessons ended in high school.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that this high school doesn't go into. It kind of hits the heavy points and moves on.
Yeah, and that comes up in the episode. You'll find out that it's just way too involved. You can't just teach a bunch of high school kids who don't want to be there all the intricate details. We barely even grasped the fact that there was a Revolutionary War.
What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
The real question I have is, do I get to consider myself a beautiful bastard after this is over? Or, I mean, is there just
a bastard?
Excellent.
Well, so Jerry brought up, you asked us the question yesterday of what topics we might want to go over. And Jerry brought up the myths of how the Revolutionary War started. And I sat there and said, what myths are there that were around how the Revolutionary War started?
I would struggle to think of myths by why the war started, but we can think about maybe not myths, but misconceptions about the revolution, if that's helpful.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the topic. I always like to hear what the falsehoods are, because, depending on what the topic is, some of the theories can get pretty wild.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true, especially with the founding moment. Well, I guess I'm curious what particular myths or misconceptions or falsehoods did you have in mind that were percolating in your head?
I actually didn't really have much because
you can see why I asked the question.
Yeah, so I figured you'd probably know some of the misconceptions because you're more well versed than I am. I'm not a great American. I have like a general overview of. I have a general overview, but I don't know Well,
that's all right. That's why you have this podcast to educate the masses.
Yeah,
my belief was always that it was a bunch of white guys who didn't want to pay their taxes.
I mean, that's part of it, right? Especially a lot of the elites who didn't necessarily want to pay taxes. But the real question is, or the several questions become, what particularly about those taxes bothered them so much? Because they're used to paying local taxes. So why not pay an imperial tax? What's the problem there? Well, a big part of the British Empire. It makes sense that you'd want to contribute to king and country.
Yeah.
What's the deal?
Well, it didn't benefit them at all, right?
Well, it depends on how you look at it, right? So maybe we can just sort of start there, because what we're really talking about is in a sense how the British Empire is supposed to function. That's what a lot of the argument is about what is the empire's purpose? How does it serve the best interest of people like George Washington or other individuals on this side of the Atlantic? How does it serve the British people back home? What role does taxation play in all of that? And we have to remember, before the American Revolution, before the war, there's a gigantic global war that precedes it. What it's called the 7 Years' War, but in this part of the world, that there's a section of it called the French and Indian War. But that war reshapes the map of North America and the British Empire here, kicks the French out of North America. Finally, the British beat the French, their hated enemies for time immemorial. But as a consequence of doing so, of fighting that long war, and of taking on the new responsibilities to defend what they would call the back country, later Americans would call the frontier, and to begin settlement of newly acquired colonies in Canada and Florida and the Caribbean, is very expensive. And I don't remember the precise number, but the British government incurs something like 187 million pounds of debt fighting the war.
Yeah.
Which, if you do the inflation calculation, which I can't do off the top of my head, but that's a lot of money. And the British people back home are already very highly taxed. And so one of the things that the British government begins to do is look for other sources of revenue. to pay back that debt, to pay back their creditors. And part of the logic is, well, we just won this great war that will theoretically benefit you Americans in terms of new opportunities. And so, maybe you should pay a little bit. Maybe you should contribute your fair share.
Do you know how much they were taxing?
Well, it depends on a variety of taxes, because they institute.
I know one.
Yeah, so there's a number of taxes. And actually, before we actually get to that part, what also is happening in this period too is that there's a change in the British ministry and the attitudes about the British government towards empire. So in 1760, King George II dies, and that brings to the throne our buddy George III. Mm. What also starts to happen towards the end of the 7 Years' War, again, what we call the French and Indian War here in North America, is that the people who had been in power for a long time in the British government, the Whigs with a capital W, and it's not precisely what we would call a liberal in the modern sense, but Whigs were people who were suspicious of monarchical power, put it that way. 1760, King George III comes to the throne, and the Tories start to come into the government as well. And so the more conservative leaning, more folks who are more interested in centralized power, it's hugely significant because they had been out of power since really the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s. Because they were allied with seemingly the deposed King James II. But the Tories are back. They have a different mindset about empire. The Whigs had been more willing to engage with Europe. The Tories are more interested in making the empire work for Britain's benefit in ways that they hadn't before, and then allowing the extractive commodities that are coming out of North America, tobacco, sugar, things like that, to power the economy, to subsidize British debt levels, and to kind of create what we would call a mercantile economy, sort of a self-contained loop, so that Britain still needs Europe. They still sell things to the continent. They are still re-exporting American goods to the continent. Some American goods can be exported directly to the continent, but they really see it as a kind of a closed cycle. And so that's as a consequence of that, of those sort of the war itself, the new ministry, the attitudes towards empire and the British government, you start to see taxes emerging. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, which is more popularly known, the Townshend duties of 1767, so taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the Tea Act of 1773, which really ticks off some people. And the precise levels of taxation, I can't think of off the top of my head, but but for example, the Stamp Act, just to recap that, the Stamp Act is placing a tax essentially on paper products. And so if you need to have a legal document, if you're printing a newspaper, even playing cards, you have to buy a royal stamp as a form of a tax. The Americans get real ticked off at that. And so the British government tries these successive taxes. And it reveals this differing American idea about empire, whereas the Americans, and we're talking about white Americans here, we can talk about enslaved peoples and Native Americans as well over the course of our chat, but folks like George Washington, Henry Lawrence in South Carolina, John Adams in Boston, they see this as an intrusion on their rights because they see their own legislative assemblies as the only legitimate power able to tax them internally. So you hear these distinctions between internal taxes and external taxes, right?
So they were kind of already at that point viewing themselves as separate from Britain.
I wouldn't say separate. I think what becomes clear in the 1760s is that suddenly both sides realized they had different views of how the empire was supposed to work. And in part, that's a product of history. The Americans, and it's kind of a falsehood to say that they were left to govern themselves. There's this old idea of what's called salutary neglect, that essentially from the mid-17th century onward, the Americans were largely able to do as they pleased within a certain political and economic regulatory framework governed by Parliament. And that's not technically true, because Parliament has been regulating the colonies in one shape or form since the beginning. in a very real sense. And Parliament and the king really has veto power over colonial legislation. And so, there's innumerable examples coming from Virginia and other colonies where they pass some law out of their assemblies. They have to send it to the king and his privy council for the evaluation. And in many instances, the king will veto it if he doesn't think it's the best interest of the whole empire. But there is this perception by the 1760s that through British attempts to tax the colonies, that the British have somehow violated the compact that had emerged historically. And so when they start saying no taxation without representation, what they're talking about is we have no representatives in Parliament. You are imposing on us what we consider to be an internal tax. And so you're taxing the physical goods that we use on a daily basis. We think only our respective assemblies have the power to do that. Parliament, if you want to regulate trade, cool. That's fine, man. Do that. But you can't impose these kinds of taxes on us that we ourselves are accustomed to actually levying through our representatives.
So at this point in time in America's history, before the revolution, did the English actually own the colonies that were here?
It's a great question. It's actually a very complicated, complex question. And I'll give you a kind of a distinction.
Sure.
Because the way that the English, later British, settle the colonies is different than, say, Spain in Central and South America. So in Central and South America, the lands that become Mexico and Peru they become kingdoms of Spain itself. And so just like Castile and Granada and all these other places, they become incorporated into the Spanish state. Works a little differently in what become the American colonies, the English and later British colonies in the 17th and 18th century. So there's a mix of corporate colonies. So for example, Virginia was founded by the Virginia Company of London. And so it starts its life off as a corporate colony. Later it transforms into a royal colony when the king takes it over in 1624. Pennsylvania is a proprietary company. William Penn essentially gets Pennsylvania to satisfy a debt that the monarch owed his father. And so he technically owns Pennsylvania and has power to make land grants and oversee the administration of the colony within certain limits. They're all loyal to the English, later British sovereign, but there's a kind of mix of royal, corporate, and proprietary colonies that emerge. And so you've got this hodgepodge mix developing by the 18th century that is very distinct from what you saw in Spain. And so the question of ownership is sort of like, well, it depends where you are, really.
Yeah, so I can see how that would lead to a lot of maybe like quasi confusion and a lot of people disagreeing on what they really should pay.
In a sense, yes. And we also have to think about the fact that at this time, it's not like all of these colonies are united. They're often competing with each other too, right? So Virginia and Pennsylvania are always competing with each other, it seems like. The Carolinas are competing with the sugar colonies, even though they're working with them half the time to supply goods and things like that. But there's also a great deal of collaboration too. Rhode Island merchants are intricately involved in the slave trade. The British sugar islands desperately need foodstuffs and timber supplies, so they're getting those from in the mid-Atlantic and the New England colonies, things like that. But there's no kind of overall cohesion, I guess might be the word, that would characterize these colonies, except for that they are all a part of this greater British Empire and that they all swear allegiance to the British monarch.
So was it actually was the Tea Party the straw that broke the camel's back then?
Very good question. I think it broke the camel's back for the British government, certainly. The Tea Act of 1773 is basically a get out of jail free card for the East India Company. What it actually does is lowers the duty on tea imported into the colonies, which makes the Americans angry for a couple of reasons. One, it lowers the duty sufficiently that it makes smuggling no longer profitable, and Americans like to smuggle, and smuggling had been kind of tolerated because it was a kind of an effective form of commerce. But it was also bailing out what Americans saw as a very corrupt company. And the East India Company is almost a quasi-sovereign arm of the British government at this point by the 1770s. And they are in massive debt, and Parliament sees this as a way to kind of fix that problem. But a lot of Americans are like, well, you're lining the pockets of complete morons who are running this company. And no. So the Boston Tea Party happens in late 1773, and it didn't happen. It didn't have to happen in Boston. It was kind of an accident because there were, multiple ships of tea going to Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Charleston, but the Boston one got there first. And when the group of Bostonians dressed as Mohawk Indians board that ship and dump the tea into the harbor and destroy several hundred, I can't remember how the exact amount, several hundred, several thousand pounds worth of tea, that for the British government is kind of the defining moment for them, that at least some segment of the American population is in willful defiance of parliamentary law, the king's authority, and they are in a state of rebellion. And actually, in 74, the king hears all of this, and he's like, well, now blows must decide whether these colonists are to be subject of the crown or independent states. And they're, at this moment, they're really talking about Boston, but they can see the potential for trouble elsewhere. And Parliament reacts. They pass the coercive acts. They shut down the Boston port. They change the government of Massachusetts. They try to isolate what they see as the locus of rebellion, and it in turn inflames a lot of other Americans as well.
And I mean, I know with talking about what Jerry was asking about what colonies fall under ownership and whatnot, that also came into later when they were trying to get together and become one cohesion. Like,
right,
it made it very difficult for everyone to get on the same page. I mean, how long were all the talks going on before they signed the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, so, and I guess speaking of myths, right, or misconceptions, I think this is one of them. Because the American Revolution is part of our founding narrative, and we have the sense that everyone was in it together, that independence was always the goal. Right, exactly. Really, you can think of the first 15 months of the war as a war of reconciliation. Americans, a lot of them, with some exception, maybe John Adams and a few of the other Bostonians, they don't want to break away. I mean, they have had good lives in the empire. It's advantageous for them, despite the taxation problems, things like that. They see themselves as part of a great imperial family that has accomplished a great deal together. There's problems. There's the taxation issue. Men like Washington feel more and more like second-class citizens in the empire, so that's part of the issue as well. But there's I would be hesitant to say that there was a great deal of desire for independence. There was a desire to push the British to reform the relationship, but not outright independency. And so you see the first Continental Congress in 1774 and the second in 1775. The first one in 74 is really towards that kind of goal of trying to figure out how do we have a coordinated response so that we can petition His Majesty and ultimately Parliament as well to see our side of things, to back down, to come to some kind of accommodation so that we can go back to the status quo. You get the war breaking out in April 19th, 1775, the next year. That changes the calculus, of course. Now it's morphed from a political and economic protest with boycotts and petitioning into an actual outright military conflict. But even then, there is still the desire, at least in the some part of delegates to the Continental Congress and Americans more broadly, for reconciliation.
Well, we've talked about it on this show before, where like, if you actually put your mind to it and think about what they were doing at that time, just like you said, before the war broke out, you're sitting there thinking, all right, if we do this, it's more than just taxations and all of a sudden we have our own colony to govern. They're going to be coming for blood. And then when the war breaks out, I imagine that's going to convince more people like, all right, the war is already here, but can we still get out of this without having more bloodshed? So, I mean, it was an interesting time to be alive. It's an interesting time to not, I mean, your decisions had a lot of weight to them.
Yeah, they really did. And they really, the pro-independence movement had to really cajole their fellow delegates, by the summer of 1776 to actually vote for independence. They start talking about it in June. It's kind of in the air already. I think it's June the 28th that Richard Lee introduces the resolution that.
Correction. Jim pointed out to us after the show that this didn't actually happen on June 28th. It was June 7th. Back to the show.
These colonies are not outright to be free and independent states, but there are a lot of holdouts. A New Jersey delegation isn't really inclined at that point. That delegation actually gets replaced on the 28th of June with a pro-independence delegation. Some of the South Carolinians are skeptical. The South Carolinians benefit from empire because they are more like the sugar colonies in the Caribbean than they are Bostonians, and they are reliant on capital injections from British banks and British merchants to fund their slaving enterprises and their plantation enterprises. So there's a lot of arm twisting, a lot of debate. But you're right. The question is, if we do this, then what next? And it's only a certain segment of the population, the white population, that is interested in independence. I mean, we can talk about the Loyalists over the course of our conversation as well, but it's not like this is a broad-based movement where it's all of white Americans thinking, "Yep, this is great. Let's do this now." It's a small segment, but having done that, having declared independence, then to your point about the colonies governing themselves, what they begin to do immediately, on the advice of the Continental Congress, that state governments, the revolutionary governments that had assumed power from the royal governments, begin to transform themselves into states. And begin to write new constitutions to govern themselves as republics and abandon their old colonial charters. In some instances, they just take pieces of the old colonial charters and reconstitute them as small R Republican constitutions. But it's happening very fast, and they're all sort of trying to figure out what to do now.
Now, when they were coming together and talking about what the new direction was going to be, did they ever talk about having something similar to a monarchy themselves, or did they all decide from the beginning, we don't want that kind of power here?
Right. It's a really excellent question. And during the period in which they're struggling for reconciliation, there are several proposals, most prominently by a Pennsylvanian named Joseph Galloway, who authors what he calls an American Plan of Union, which would essentially have created an American parliament and then created a president general who would kind of oversee the colonies, and that the Americans would have some kind of larger pan-continental representation, but they would still be part of the British Empire. And so what they're doing in a lot of ways is anticipating the later British Commonwealth. That's what they really see. They see themselves united by the king. They recognize Parliament's right to regulate trade and taxation from that level, but they're really anticipating just seeing the king as the head of state, and they can have this pan-American parliament to coordinate, defense in case the pernicious French ever come back and try something funny. That plan of union fails by one vote in the First Continental Congress. Now, if it had been passed, who knows what would have come of it? Probably the king and parliament would have said, "Thanks, but no, this is the way things work." But that gives you some sense of the tension within the American leadership itself at that point, as they're trying to figure out a way out of this. Whether or not they would think of having a king post-independence, there was some talk of that, but not really. I mean, and I think you see a sign of that early when, as soon as they've got independence, they begin talking about what really was what some people call America's first constitution, which would be the Articles of Confederation. But was really just a peace treaty of sorts, an alliance among the several states to coordinate the war effort and maintain a kind of defensive alliance amongst themselves. And the fact that Congress persists until the Constitution without any kind of real head. I mean, there is a president of Congress. He can't really do anything, but Congress is really just a kind of committee of states, I think is significant. And it tells you a lot about their suspicion of centralized authority, because well into the 19th century, the locus of power remains with the states themselves, even after the Constitution. So there wasn't a whole lot of real talk of an American monarch at that point. Now, fears of that come later during the early republic when they start talking about a president. But
Wasn't he more like a referee than anything else? Like he just kept the peace at the meetings to a degree,
Yeah,
or
in a
things
lot
in
of ways, it
line,
was.
anyways.
Yeah, it was like a lot of ways. It was kind of ceremonial. I mean, John Hancock was president of the Continental Congress at one point. So was Henry Lawrence. Washington communicates with the president of Congress as opposed to well, he does communicate with the committees, but he's always in contact with Hancock or some of these other folks. It's a real problem after the war is over because there's essentially a committee of representatives from states trying to make decisions, and it's not going well because they're thinking about their experiences from the war in terms of taxation. They can't get anything done. They can't raise revenue. It was not a great time to be alive in Congress at that point.
Now, you had talked about the Loyalists beforehand, and that's
Mhm.
actually one aspect I never really thought of. And I would think when you're going into this, or when they were going into this, you probably would already know who the Loyalists were. And coming out of it, you could at least know where they were, but that might not have been true.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And you would think so, right? Like, oh, you can sort of see which way people are going to go.
Yeah.
And in reality, it's not the case. I mean, some people were pretty hardcore king and country from the beginning, but a lot of people would switch sides depending on the context or the situation in which they found themselves.
The
you're
movement
gonna
of the wind.
right. If a big old British army's coming your way and you've got some property, well, like I was always pro king. We're good.
Yeah,
I'll put on that red coat. But yeah, another sort of misconception about what we're talking about is that the American Revolution it's a civil war. It's really the first American Civil War. It's a civil war on kind of an imperial level. It's a civil war between two British peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's an internal civil war amongst Americans. And Loyalists remain loyal for a variety of reasons. Some really believe in the sanctity of the monarch and have religious implications for that as well. I mean, the king is the head of the Anglican Church. If you're an Anglican clergyman, chances are you're going to be loyalist. Some are loyal because they see what they would call the rebellion as an unnatural rebellion, so that there's a natural order to society. There's the king, there's the the elites, there's the middling sort, and then there's the poor people, and that's the way that things should be. And that this rebellion is a kind of leveling movement that's trying to upset the natural order. And you don't want to anger God either, because God likes the natural order of things as well.
Right.
You don't want him on your bad side. And some have financial reasons for remaining loyalists. As I talked about, those planters. The reason the Caribbean colonies, who sympathize with a lot of the Americans, don't rebel is because they need that cash from Britain to fund their operations. They can't do without it, even though some of them, have inclinations and sympathies with the Americans, and others just because they hate the Patriots. They don't like upsetting the old order. They don't like patriots who are in their face all the time about the king and all this kind of stuff, and so they hate them. And a lot of people try to stay out of the way. They're trying to not get caught up in it all.
And that's, like I said, I think that's a big part of it, that nowadays, being an American and just looking at what the way thing is, it's just easy to overlook. I mean, there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
Day-to-day business must have just been insane.
Yeah, because in some ways you have to compartmentalize it, right? Because you need to try to explain the war, especially when you're in the classroom or just to the general public. Like there was disputes about taxation. Some Americans weren't happy about that. It leads to a revolution/war and ultimately independence. But the reality is it's a much more complex, complicated situation. And what a lot of historians are interested in doing now is sort of talking about the experiences of people as they tried to deal with the war itself or the revolution and try to navigate their way through it, trying to figure out, just how they're going to survive and what opportunities they can avail themselves of in the process.
Now, have we discovered, as I guess historians, we'll talk about them, have they discovered kind of what that looked like for people on an individual level?
Historians have been doing a lot of great work recently on uncovering those kinds of stories, focusing on enslaved people who used the chaos of the war and the opportunities that the British offered them to free themselves, women who took the opportunity to either work for either respective armies and earn wages. Women like Catherine Greene, who was the wife of General Nathaniel Greene, who essentially takes over the family business because her husband's off to war. And we know a lot more about how women who remained at home were actually running family businesses, running family farms, keeping things moving. And so it's really fascinating to look at the ways in which life in a strange way goes on, or people are adapting to the wartime situation. We, in the Loyalists, for example, we have a great, we have a more understanding of how, of what happened to those folks who decided to go into exile after the war. We think about 68,000 or so leave what become the United States after the war. Some leave later. They're called the late Loyalists. They're like, this Republican stuff, small R Republican stuff, we're not going to do it. Let's go to Canada. But we know a lot more about what we call the Loyalist diaspora and where people go in Britain and Nova Scotia and East Florida, things like that. So it's part of the recent sort of resurgence of what we would call social history. And looking at ordinary lives, or looking at lives themselves and the individual experiences they have, and marrying that with the political and economic history and the literature that has come out in the last 25, 30 years to enrich our understanding of how people actually lived and what they did. And it's been really great.
Well, it's so easy to hit the keynotes, right? And just be like, oh, this happened, and that's great. But there's so much more to it, just like you said, those are lives there. And if you think about your daily, what you deal with on a daily basis, and the decisions you make aren't even close to that, and the repercussions are it's very interesting to me to put yourself in those shoes.
Yeah, and I'll give you a concrete example. A colleague of mine at Carleton College named Serena Zabin has written a marvelous book called The Boston Massacre of Family History. And we typically think of the Boston Massacre as the mob in Boston and the soldiers who opposed them, and the soldiers fired. And some people ended up dead. John Adams defends them in court. He wins, but it's a larger sort of precursor to the rebellion. And what Professor Zabin has done in that book is shows the ways in which the British Army, who is stationed in Boston, is really integrated into the life of Boston. They're marrying locals. They are doing business with local shopkeepers. They are part of the economy. They're, looking for places to settle. And the Bostonians are looking for those same opportunities with the Army, marrying an Army officer, maybe going someplace else after their rotation is out, things like that. It's a whole, it's one of my favorite books, and it's actually really kind of inspired me in the way I'm thinking about my own writing, in ways in which you are able to open up entire new worlds by looking at the sources a different way and asking kind of different questions about an event that we think we know, but we really don't.
I mean, and John Adams got a whole lot of flack for representing everyone in that.
He did, but he thought he was upholding the law and doing what he was supposed to do as an attorney.
And I imagine that probably hurt him down the line when he was trying to convince everyone, or working with people to convince everyone to become independent.
Actually, not really. He takes some flack for it at the time a little bit, but the way he frames it is within these kind of language of expectations of British membership in the empire, the philosophical principles underpinning that. He was a great student of a lot of what we would now recognize as small R Republican philosophers, Sidney Algernon and James Harrington and folks like that. And so he was kind of speaking a language that a lot of Americans, even if they hadn't read those texts, they intuitively kind of understood by the process of political seasoning, I guess you could say. And he relies on a lot of that philosophy later when he is urging his colleagues to go forward towards independence in the Second Continental Congress.
So when you had mentioned that they regarded central power with a lot of suspicion, how did we end up in a situation where they kind of consolidated to a single president? And that also gets me wondering, how much power then did the president have compared to the one we have now?
Yeah, excellent questions. On the one hand, not on the one hand, to start with the first part where, what's going on after the war? Why do we get a president? I mean, to generalize, things were a mess. The period after the war, so 1784 to 1789, before the installation of the new federal government, is what we call the critical period. And we call it the critical period because it was a critical moment in which it wasn't clear whether or not this new republic was going to survive, or if it was going to be dismembered into its various parts. If the Spanish, who are still out in the Southwest, what is the old Southwest, if they're going to try to entice some states into the Spanish fold, if the British will get some ideas and try to peel off some other parts under their sway, even though they had just fought a war against them. And there were also, a great many problems. So they have this Continental Congress. This Continental Congress has no power. And that makes sense to us because if the revolution was fought in some ways in opposition of centralized power, well, why are you going to give this new governing body any kind of power? So the government can't tax, or the Continental Congress can't tax. What it can do is say, hey, Virginia, could you send us like $10,000, please? And, Virginia can say, sure, or most likely go to hell, essentially is what happens. The issue is that the United States, to prosecute the war, to fight the war, like their British predecessor, has contracted an enormous amount of debt. So they owe the French, and that causes a huge problem for the French. That leads into the French Revolution, but that's a whole other podcast. They owe the Dutch. They owe some other creditors. The states owe money to these various entities. The federal government, it's not really a federal government, but the Confederation government owes money, but they have no power to tax. They can't pay back their bills. They can't really treat with foreign powers. The foreign powers have a king or some kind of monarch in other places, in this sort of few number of republics that exist. They have a president or a prime minister or whatever. They don't want to deal with a Congress. They don't want to deal with a committee. They want to meet with a person face to face, or at least have a person who is invested with the authority to deal on behalf of their people. So that causes problems. And there's also the fact that the Confederation government cannot put down rebellions. So there is Shays Rebellion very early in the critical period. It's an agrarian rebellion in Western Massachusetts in which farmers are upset about debt, inflation, taxation. There's a similar one in Western Virginia. And that's the moment when men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton realize, oh crap, we got to do something. All these problems are compounding. And so they call a convention in Annapolis for 1786. Hardly anybody shows up, but the important people do, like Madison and Hamilton, and they decide, all right, Philadelphia, 1787, let's go there. Our objective will be to revise the Articles of Confederation. But of course, when they get there, they're like, nope, let's rewrite the whole thing and write a new constitution. And so they developed the new constitution in part in response to these problems: the lack of taxation. They empower the federal government to do that. Lack of clear foreign diplomacy. So the president is invested with those powers in consultation with the Senate, and some other things as well. And, with the president, they're very careful. They write it in a way that that person doesn't have a whole lot of clearly defined powers that gets figured out. But really, the important thing is that everybody in the room knows that if this thing passes, if the Constitution is adopted, that Washington is going to be the first president. And they feel comfortable enough eventually with the document they come up with, knowing that, because they know his reputation. They know that while he would be delighted by being president, he pretends like he doesn't want it. And so he is that self-effacing person who is putting forth his own civic virtue. They saw the ways in which he subordinated himself to civilian authorities during the war. And, if you think about history, right, that could have gone very differently. We've had a Caesar, we've had Cromwell, Napoleon, who are invested with power by civilians only to turn on that civilian body. Washington doesn't do that. So they think, all right, we'll do this. In Washington, we expect will be president, and we trust him with that power, and we'll sort of figure out the rest as we go along.
His presidency kind of didn't end on a great note.
No, it didn't. he was real tired by the end. He
A little
he
bit.
could have stood for a third term, but 1797, he's like, I'm out, I'm done. In part because of the emergence of political parties, which the founders had not wanted, but were already in the ether anyway. And so the division into these emerging camps of the Federalists and the Republicans, capital R Republicans, or Democratic Republicans, but Republicans for simplicity's sake, not the Lincoln Republicans / modern Republicans, but Jeffersonian Republicans, causes him a great deal of consternation. And he decided, you know what, I've done my bid for king and country. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go back to Mount Vernon, which is where he wanted to be anyway.
You had mentioned that it was kind of a gray area in terms of what their power was.
Right.
And I feel like even now, like if I watch the news, I don't really know what Biden could get away with doing on his own because it's not really clear. So it's always been that way.
In some ways, yes. And in some, more formal ways, legislative ways, but also in some kind of cultural, practical ways. And so for the latter, for example, Washington has these weekly levees, he calls them. This is actually a kind of holdover from kingly type things where you have a kind of weekly reception for people around town, prominent guests. And the question that Washington has to figure out is, should I shake hands with people or should I put my hands behind my back? And so that's kind of like the sort of a practical cultural thing. It's not clear, does it diminish the president's authority and standing if he shakes hands with individuals or if he has them behind his back, standing prominently, bows to people as they come in, makes, polite talk, things like that. So, you still see that in the news today, receiving lines. Now the president shakes hands, but
yeah.
But in other real ways, it's unclear in the early years of the presidency, how some of his powers are actually supposed to be executed. So, for example, early on in his presidency, Washington is involved in negotiating a treaty with some Native American peoples. And, when the president negotiates a treaty today, he concludes it. The document is sent to the Senate for advice and consent. The Senate votes, that treaty up or down. If they vote yes, it becomes, part of the law of the land. Wasn't clear what advice and consent meant in that period. Okay. So Washington takes it literally. He literally goes to the Senate and it's like, what do you think, guys? And they're like, we don't think you should be here. This is sort of like the king showing up in Parliament. You're not supposed to do that. And allegedly Washington, he goes twice, and the second time, it's very clear that they don't think he should be there. And he walks out and supposedly he says something like, that's the last damn time I'm ever going to do that. And no president has gone back since. And so the advice and consent has always, from that time forward, been the Senate deliberating as a body about the wisdom of that treaty and whether or not they should vote for it. So it's that kind of stuff. And actually a document that we have that's not too far from where I'm sitting. So I'm in the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, and down the hallway in our vault, I don't think that's giving away the location. It's not like you could break in anyway. Is exactly, here's the code. Is
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, exactly. 1776.
Yeah.
We have a document called the Acts of Congress. And in the winter of his first presidency, 1789, Washington has the Constitution and then all the laws passed by the first session of Congress bound together in this book. And he gives one to Jefferson and some other cabinet members and the Supreme Court and whatnot. But in his copy, Washington, who very, very rarely wrote in his books, he's not like some of the other of his generation, or now where we scrawl in our books. But after this incident with the Senate, he actually starts to go through that document and note in the Constitution where the president's powers are mentioned, and kind of makes a little notation about what he's supposed to do or what he thinks he's supposed to be doing, what are required of him as opposed to may, so that legal distinction between shall do this and may do this is quite important. So he's, the president shall give an annual message to Congress on the State of the Union. So he writes something like, required in there. You can actually see him kind of interpreting the Constitution, interpreting what the powers of the presidency are, figuring it out in real time, what he's supposed to be doing.
That's awful.
It sounds funny in practice because I can just imagine him writing down, note to self, don't ask permission on treaties.
Exactly. Exactly.
Imagine that nowadays where you go into a job and they're like, all right, here you go. See you later.
Yeah. We'll see. Yeah, exactly.
I have to read this book to figure out what the hell I'm doing here.
Right. Well, and the question still persists in our own time, right? Right now, President Biden is theoretically deliberating whether or not he can cancel student debt. He claims he doesn't have the executive authority to do that. Some legal scholar says that he has. He says that he would rather have Congress do that. Some say he has the power to cancel $10,000 of student debt. I hope he finds the authority to do that because it would really help me out, man. but even today, it's like, even if, especially in stuff that's not specified in the Constitution, they're having to go through these statutes and figure out, all right, what kind of legislative authority or executive authority does the president have to do his job?
It's interesting that we've kind of forgotten over time what they can and cannot do.
Yeah. Yeah. And the presidency has acquired, to go back to your earlier comment question, the presidency has acquired more power over time. It's something that scholars call the imperial presidency these days, where they have aggregated so much power into the executive office. For example, making war without Congress's authorization. There is the War Powers Act that theoretically the president is supposed to ask Congress, or is supposed to justify intervention after a set period of time, but only Congress can declare war. And so can the president really, in the interest of national security, launch an attack when you haven't declared war?
He can.
In practice, yeah, he can. He's like, I'm commander in chief. So yeah.
Yeah, well, there's also, he can send the United States Marine Corps. They don't need Congress.
Right.
That's written into the bylaw. Like, they don't need Congress to go to war. So if he wants to start something with someone, that's who he's going to start it with.
The Marines. Yeah. That's the questions. A lot of the questions get resolved over the ensuing centuries, but a lot we're still trying to figure out.
It's an interesting time, and a lot of it, like, it's a horrible place to get it. But at the HBO series, John Adams. I know, Jerry, you haven't watched it.
I haven't.
If you haven't watched it, you need to go watch it. If you're any sort of history buff with American history, it's a fantastic show to watch. There's another one too. I can't remember.
It is very good.
Jefferson? Is
there one on Jefferson? I don't know. I don't think so. But yeah, the Adams one. I mean, it's 15 years old now or something, but it's pretty good. The thing I love about that series is the accents. I know that they did a lot of work trying to figure out the early American accent, and how close they got, we'll never know because all those guys are dead. But it's one of the things that sort of we used to mull around in our minds. People still do, like, did Washington speak with a hint of an English accent because he was an upper crust Virginian, or we just don't know. So
I imagine. I mean, how long had he been in the country? Or, like, at that time when in the country had accents disappeared.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's unclear. Well, I mean, in that period of time, you would have heard of a cacophony of sounds, really. English, Irish, Scottish, Moravian, German, Pennsylvania Dutch, what we call today, any number of Native American languages. By that period, a lot of the Native American population was no longer near the coast as they once were, although that's not entirely the case. There are some populations still, but Creek, Cherokee, Iroquois, various African languages from enslaved people. We know that various languages there. So
you had discussed earlier about the slaves and their feelings towards the war. That's one thing I've never really heard of anything about.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great research in recent years on that. In part because what the British figure out how to do very quickly is weaponize slavery against the rebels. Great example is the November 1775 proclamation by Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promising emancipation to anyone who rallies to the king's standards. And he eventually formed something called the Ethiopian Regiment. His efforts aren't entirely successful, but the British see that as a tactic that they can use against people like Washington, people like Henry Lawrence. They can leverage enslaved people's desire for self-emancipation and freedom against the Americans, so they can, fill their ranks and whatnot. And so you see a lot of flight to freedom by enslaved peoples. One example is we hear from Mount Vernon. There were several people who escaped to a British warship called the HMS Savage. A number of them were eventually recaptured and returned to Washington. There was another enslaved man named Harry Washington, and I can explain why he has that last name here in a second. But Harry Washington flees early in the war to Lord Dunmore. He eventually serves in the Ethiopian Regiment, and eventually becomes a member of what's called the Black Pioneers, which is a kind of subordinate logistical unit that a lot of British regiments had, and eventually goes into exile, gets out of what becomes the United States at the end of the war, goes to Nova Scotia, and then eventually on to Sierra Leone by the late 18th century. And the reason he has the name Washington, not entirely clear, but so many people flee from their masters during the war that at the end of the war, there's a kind of arbitration between the British and the Americans about returning enslaved people, returning enslaved property. The Americans obviously want them back. As you can imagine, the enslaved people are like, nope, we're good. We're formerly enslaved people. And as a consequence of that arbitration process, and it's complicated, but we can go into it if you want, there's something that's called the Book of Negroes that exists, in which everyone who is leaving, formerly enslaved, who has a valid, essentially a passport and certificate, is entered into this book. And Harry's name is in there, and he mentions that he was formerly the enslaved person of General Washington. And so probably at that point, the last name and the first name were put together, and he became Harry Washington. But he and a number of formerly enslaved people end up in Nova Scotia, where it was cold as hell, and then eventually took the British up on their offer to help settle Sierra Leone in Africa late in the 18th century.
They made one hell of a trip.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating process. There's a great book by Cassandra Pybus. I think it's called Journeys to Freedom, in which she tells Harry's story. But there's also the side, right, where there are African Americans who fight for the Patriots. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment has a number of African American men serving in it. A story named Judith Van Buskirk has a great book called Standing in Their Own Light, which is all about African Americans serving in Patriot forces. And so there's a lot more we know about folks like Harry Washington, folks who are serving in either the Royal Army or the British Army or the Patriot side these days, as a consequence of these kind of new questions that we're asking.
Now, in your research, I gotta imagine, I would think everything you're looking at has already been looked at thousands of times. Are you finding new things, or is it just you're taking it from a different angle?
Yeah, yes and no. And so some sources, right, it's bringing a fresh perspective. It's asking new questions. It's thinking about the questions that past historians have asked and considering it from a different angle. Historians, we theoretically like to imagine ourselves as being objective, but no one can,
it's very difficult,
fully purge their biases. But questions of the present help animate our questions of the past. And so thinking about how do the legacies of slavery, what do we see the legacies of slavery in our own time? We start to think about structural racism. We start to think about, resistance to slavery and resistance to racism in our own time. Well, let's ask some questions of the past and the sources there. In other cases, it's actually quote unquote new sources. So either sources that have been discovered or sources that are difficult to get to. For enslaved people, we really don't have anything in their own words. It's very rare, actually, unfortunately, to find something in their own words. An escaped slave named Ona Judge is one example. She self-emancipated from the Washingtons in 1796 and later gave an interview in the 1840s about her experiences. But in a lot of instances, we'll see the name of an enslaved person or mention of an enslaved person in the letters of their enslavers, or more prominently, probably in their account books, and what they paid for this person, what labor that they're doing. Washington, and we're really lucky here at Mount Vernon because Washington was such a meticulous documentarian of his estate and of the labor being performed here. And so we've got these farm reports from his estate managers and from himself, where they are talking about the work that individual enslaved people are doing. And we can begin to use those and bring fresh perspectives, fresh questions to those documents. And then when stuff turns up, we have a more complete picture that helps us reconstruct those lives.
Now, I'd imagine that because this is the sort of thing that you do a lot of research on, you've probably come across this, but I think it was maybe a month or two ago, I've been seeing things come across my YouTube feed, which are videos, or really they're recordings with just an image laid over it. And a lot of it was recorded in the very early 1900s, talking to freed slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a strange thing to listen to something where you're interviewing someone who used to be a slave. And this was, they were a slave in the early 1800s. And they talk about, what their point of view was on slavery, and kind of like very conflicted feelings about being freed too.
Yeah, so you're talking about the Works Progress Administration, the WPA narratives in the 1930s.
Yeah,
which are a fascinating account of folks who were formerly enslaved, later freed at the end of the Civil War and before. And yeah, it's a really rich resource of both life as an enslaved person, later freed person, but it's also a really interesting way to think about the power dynamics between the interviewer and the interviewee, right?
Yeah.
So in a lot of cases, and there's been some work done on this, in most cases, the interviewee or interviewer would have been white.
Right.
And so the research suggests that there is, on the part of the interviewee, attempts to kind of mollify or kind of give the interviewer what they want to hear. And so, we're in thinking about the time period and what this has done, right? In the 1930s, this is still kind of the heyday of the lost cause narrative, the lost cause narrative being predominantly from the southern states and the old Confederacy, that, we could never win the war in the first place. And that, and this is my, putting favorite in air quotes here, my favorite claim is that racism didn't exist before the war. And so, so there are fascinating look at how there is a dialogue going on there that's both spoken and unspoken. And you can kind of detect the ways in which the interviewees, the formerly enslaved people, are being very careful about what they say and how they approach and try to treat with the interviewer. But there are also great resources, like the great resources for reconstructing family histories, for understanding the Southern economy in that period, for understanding the process of emancipation and the chaos of the Civil War. They're fantastic.
You make a good point about how they kind of temper how they respond in the interview because of the dynamic. So I didn't hear them say themselves anything that was too direct, but I heard another one from, I don't remember the names, as I just I passed through them pretty quickly.
Yeah, sure.
But there was a white guy who was recorded around the same time frame, and he was being interviewed about his interactions with the Black population, because he was trying to basically give them equal rights and things like that. So he was one of the people working towards that. So they interviewed him about his conversation with them. And because of that dynamic, they were more comfortable talking to him. And one thing that I found really interesting, it was a pretty powerful statement, was he said that when he was talking to a Black gentleman, I don't know what his name was, but he told him, "I'm trying to win you your rights so that you can be a full citizen here in the United States." And his response was, "Oh, well, I was born with rights, so you can't get me those." Basically, everybody has rights. All they have to do is stop taking them away.
Yeah, that's a really powerful response, right?
Yeah.
It's claiming the rights that you already have. That the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But possessing those rights naturally as this interviewer had pointed out, was different than actually being able to exercise them effectively. And one of the key things that happens post Civil War is that Southern states figure out how to circumvent, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, reimpose black codes, and then Jim Crow and things like that, and limit newly freed people's participation in the democratic process.
Now, going back to the Revolutionary War, when it turned out that America won their independence, what happened to the slaves that made the deal with England that didn't go and do work for them? They just ended up coming back to where they came from, right?
It's hard to tell. And so we know that several thousands, probably 10,000 or so, were able to escape, with the evacuating British Army. Those who did not have one of those valid certificates, those valid passports, they were probably sent back to their enslavers. One of the clever things that the British general, Sir Guy Carleton, who's overseeing the evacuation, does, and then infuriates Washington to no end, is he says, well, I see that the peace negotiators have put a clause in the treaty that says enslaved property will be returned, back to their masters. Well, I interpret that to be active as of the date that the document is signed, not when they actually fled. So all those people who fled up until September of 1783, and they've got the certificates, they can go with us. And too bad, so sad, GW, you can't have them back, which Washington was pretty angry about. And then Sir Guy Carleton refused to see him the next day to talk about it further. We don't know. I don't think we know enough about the people who were recaptured, who were sent back to their enslavers. I think that is an area that is in need of research. We have a clearer sense through documents like the Book of Negroes, where people like Harry Washington went, what happened to them, but not a clear sense, I think. And I could be wrong, but I can't recall reading anything recently that would give some insight into that. So I think that's an area where we need to do a lot more work. The perspective freedom that gets taken away.
Now, I think it was in the last month, maybe the last 2 months, they found several, or maybe one they found, I think one they unearthed, time capsules from the Civil War.
Oh, sure.
Have they been uncovering anything like that from a Revolutionary War or that time frame at all?
I don't know. The one that comes to mind, and I may be misremembering this, I thought that there was one in Boston a few years ago that was uncovered, but was probably damaged from water damage, but I don't know.
I would think it would be impossible not to be.
Yeah. Well, that is part of the problem with some of the Civil War era stuff. Well, and post-Civil War, actually, down here in Virginia, they removed the Robert E. Lee statue from Monument Avenue in Richmond, and there was a time capsule. There's actually two.
Yeah, that was one of them.
Yeah, one was severely damaged, but then the other one was actually amazingly in great shape, relatively so. I mean, I watched the live stream of them pulling stuff out, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, I watched that same live stream. It was very interesting. Now, do you know anything about how much Freemasonry played into basically the start of the Revolutionary War?
Not really. I think that tends to be a History Channel thing, where they're like there was an Illuminati and they were conspiring against the British.
Less more than the conspiracy theory,
Yeah.
But I mean, of our founding fathers, majority of them were Freemasons, but that was a thing of culture back then.
Yeah, it was, and actually, it's funny enough we're talking about that because I'm giving a talk on the 26th to the Masons at the National Masonic Memorial about radicalization of Washington's friends and enemies before the war. But it was certainly a social thing. It's an area I don't know much about. But there's actually a new book coming out by a man named Mark Tabbert, which is about Washington and Freemasonry. And it'll be coming out from the University of Virginia Press this spring or early summer. So
I know it was a big part of his life. I know that the Bible he signed in on was a Bible from Freemasonry. It's like a group that guarded.
My great grandfather was a Freemason, and I remember seeing some of the texts when I was a kid. I have no idea what they mean, But I'm not well versed in the masonry aspect of the American Revolution.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have to use my I don't know
That's what
card.
we'll have to look into.
Exactly.
So as a historian, with your pretty extensive knowledge on the history here, how often do you speculate on what could have been?
It's fun to play counterfactuals, and it's actually an exercise that we do to try to explain what did happen. Because, we're not simply interested in what happened, but we have to explain why it happened. What are the motivations behind the people and things like that. And so, one of the fun things, right, is Washington himself. Washington desperately wanted nothing more in life to wear the red coat of a British officer in his youth. Never gets it for a variety of reasons. But his big moment is in 1755 at the defeat of General Braddock at the Monongahela.
Mm-hmm.
And Braddock is wounded. Washington leads a successful retreat, a pretty highly guarded retreat. Washington had been trying to get someone to sponsor him or to look favorably upon him to get that British commission, because you just couldn't, you couldn't just become an officer. You either had to buy a commission or someone had to vouch for you. And I often wonder if Braddock had lived and he had then personally vouched for Washington after that evacuation, talked about his gallantry, how he successfully led the retreat. If Braddock had lived and he had vouched for Washington with the Secretary at War and eventually the King, and Washington got that red coat, how things could have been different. Washington at that point, was all in on the British Empire. And part of his souring on the British Empire is not getting that commission and seeing ways that the empire is not working for Americans. But if he'd gotten that red coat, I often kind of wonder if there had been a rebellion, which side would he have been on?
Well, I mean, just in general with the rebellion, I mean, it could have very easily gone the other way, right?
Yeah, the Americans had some things going for them in terms of both home field advantage, and all they had to do was not lose.
But I mean, just starting.
Oh, right,
You know what I
right,
mean?
right.
Like, if you had enough people who just chimed up in the other direction, does it even light off?
Yeah, it's if the Americans had seen the Boston Tea Party as simply Boston's problem, as opposed to seeing the British reaction to it, as opposed to them seeing that reaction to it as indicative of something that was going to infringe upon their rights, it might have been a little different. Like, it's crap, the Bostonians are causing problems again. Here we go. Just shut up, guys, and we'll be fine. But no, they, as they say in the Michael Jordan documentary, they took it personally, and they and it became something much larger.
Now, this is kind of like a two-part question in this realm here. What would have happened if the British won, and what was their actual plan if they did win? Like, were they just going to go back to business as usual? Seems like it'd be kind of hard to do that after that everybody was pissed off like that.
Yeah, to take the second part of the question, I don't know if I've ever seen that kind of advanced planning. I can talk about their reaction after they lose, and how they start to rethink the nature of the empire itself. But I haven't thought that far ahead. They haven't thought that far ahead because they're trying to win. And it's complicated for them, as I said, right? The Americans have home field advantage. The American army, the Continental Army, just has to not lose, has to avoid annihilation. That's Washington's key objective. Washington, wants to be a very aggressive commander, but he realizes the army's gone, the ball game's over. The British, there is a sense that the rebellion must be quelled, but there are a lot of actually British Army officers who are sympathetic to the Americans, or at least some of the arguments that they're making. And so the Howe brothers, who early in the war are commander-in-chief of the army, and Sir William Howe is in command of the army. His brother, Lord Admiral Richard Howe, is in command of the Navy. They have sympathies with the Americans. They had actually been trying to back channel with Benjamin Franklin before the war breaks out to try to reach some kind of accommodation, but they're still, going to do their duty for king and country. They take an approach that is a kind of, if we hit them hard enough, they'll come back to the negotiating table and this will all be over. What they probably should have done is just gone in and got the job done with a heavy hand, and that might have
Shock
that
and
might
awe.
have, shock and all that might have quelled the rebellion, that
Mhm.
might have inflamed it even worse. We don't know.
Mm.
But the Hows choose this tactic. They choose, they invade New York in 1776. Washington loses Manhattan. The British hold Manhattan throughout the entire war, key strategic port, but they don't hit the Americans as hard as they probably could have. And they also have the logistical problem of sending men and material 3,000 miles from home.
It's a long ride.
Right. It's a long ride. They are hoping that there are loyalists who will come out of the woodwork in the South. That's part of the Southern strategy. In the later parts of the war, Sir Henry Clinton goes down to Virginia and then eventually to Charleston. They take Charleston in 1780, and they think, well, if we take these key Southern ports and territories, the loyalists who have been hiding and afraid of the Patriots will come out of the woodwork. They'll rally to the King's standard and we'll finish this thing. And it doesn't really happen. So they've got a bit of an intelligence failure there, unfortunately for them. But yeah, I often do wonder if they had just brought full might to bear, if they had not, from the House perspective, tried to inflict some soft blows to bring the Americans back in line and in this business, if they had just brought the thunder, I guess you might say, things could have been different. We might all be still loyal subjects of Her Majesty the Queen right now.
Have very strange accents. Now, as far as like military tactics, I mean, we look back, or at least I look back at it today, and I think, like, why would we ever go at this? But that was what they did for that era. Was there anything that we did that was just completely off the wall, crazy?
Well, yeah, actually, the Battle of Trenton in Christmas of 1776, when Washington, crosses the Delaware and attacks the Hessian position in Trenton, was kind of insane. Because usually what you did in the 18th century is when it gets cold as hell, you go into winter quarters, and everyone sort of mutually agrees that we're not going to fight anymore because this is dumb.
Mm-hmm.
But what Washington,
Jerry would second that.
yeah, like this is just, we're not going to do it. We're going to go into our camp, and we'll see you in the spring. Sharpen your bayonets and make sure your powder's dry, and we'll have our fun in a couple of months. It's not really that simple, of course. They're always doing something, but the problem for Washington in December of 76 is that the enlistments are going to run out. Morale is in the toilet. The rebellion is hanging on a knife's edge, or standing on a knife's edge, if he doesn't do something to kind of inspire confidence in the army, his own leadership, and to bloody the British nose that, they're not going to roll over as they think that we are. And so crossing the Delaware in that December and striking at the Hessians, and then later at Princeton, was a pretty kind of insane move. The British don't see it coming, and the Hessians don't see it coming because, they're like, all right, winter quarters. So it's Christmas time. You're not going to cross that river. It's chock full of ice, because it would be dumb. But that was really important because the British, as I had just said, they had invaded New York. They had taken Lower Manhattan. They had boxed Washington's ears, as my grandfather might say, all around the island. And they needed a victory, and they got one.
I'm trying to remember. Was it the Gray Fox?
The Swamp Fox.
Swamp Fox. But I can't remember his name though.
Francis Marion.
He was the one who guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, he was the inspiration for the Mel Gibson character in The Patriot.
Oh, was he? I didn't even know that.
Yep.
Really?
Yeah, Francis Marion, big deal. My wife's from South Carolina. They all love him, some Francis Marion. There's a bunch of people named Francis down there for this guy. But yeah, he basically was a practitioner of what we would now call guerrilla warfare, harassing the British, things like that, disrupting supply lines.
Yeah, because they were all used to standing in line, beating drums, and take a shot and then get hit and stand in line, just take it again.
Yeah, and it's funny too, thinking about tactics and strategy. I mean, the British did have some experience fighting in North America. They had just done it, 15 years earlier. But there were a lot of people, recruits, generals, whatnot, who had not. And so they were not accustomed to fighting in the woods, essentially. And so the topography and the landscape is also a pretty key advantage for the Americans in this war, and particularly in the South. because it's hot. There are bugs everywhere. There are swamps. It's just god awful, and Francis Marion and folks like that are willing to engage in tactics that are that a lot of people would have recognized as Native American tactics. Coming out of the woods, terrifying their opponents, striking quickly, things like that.
Now, I can understand, I guess, the efficiency of operating a battle where you just march two groups of people together.
Mhm.
It seems really dumb.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like nowadays, you're like, God, I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah,
We
well,
just
I mean,
stand here while people shoot at me.
Exactly. I mean, it was a way to maintain discipline, right? Maintain your
Yeah.
formations, but also a reflection of the technology. The smooth bore, flintlock, muskets, and occasionally a rifle. They don't have an effective range of more than 75, 100 yards.
Mhm.
So the chances of actually hitting somebody are rare. And so the idea is that you fire off a couple of volleys, fix bayonets, and then charge and try to drive your opponent off the battlefield. And if you claim the field, you've claimed victory.
Yeah. And
It's because
thinking
the rounds
back,
were too damn big.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking back to then, compared to now, I guess, it makes sense with the technology, but I don't know, maybe what's going through someone's mind when they're marching up against a wall of people shooting at them. Like, I guess their aim's not that good. It's smooth bore. It'll probably hit the guy next to me instead.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think especially on the British side, which they're highly disciplined, highly trained. They are a professional army. They've got composure. Now that doesn't mean that they're not afraid or scared, but they're able to maintain discipline. Whereas the Americans, a lot of those folks were, they've been in militias, but militias were more important in the backcountry where there was perceived threat. Whereas in the coastal regions, it was more of a social club thing. So you showed up, you did some marches and cool man, you went home and you did your monthly or whatever regimental or your militia duty. And so part of the problem that Washington has is that he doesn't have a professional army that can fight against a disciplined one. And so he doesn't really get it until Valley Forge when, the famous Baron von Steuben comes and whips the army into shape, shouting at them in, obscenities in both French and German. And then, when he runs out of words, he has people swear at them in English and things like that. Another misconception we have is that, the war was kind of bloodless. It was actually a pretty violent war. And, especially in the Southern campaigns, there are soldiers' accounts of just, kind of terrible bloodlust. And one of the things I think would be really fascinating, and folks have done this for the Civil War era, and certainly the World War I, is to think about what we would now identify as PTSD. That really hasn't been done for the American Revolution. And I would be fascinated to see that.
Could you even admit that you had PTSD after that? Because I guarantee you had soldiers come home and turn to drunks and lose their minds. But I guarantee there were a lot more that came home and just shut their mouth.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. And they would not have had the language to describe what we would now, what they called shell shock in World War I or PTSD in the modern era. So it's an outstanding question. We just don't know how the mental health of the American army or the British army for that matter. Well, we just don't have a great deal of insight into that, I think.
They also, to a degree, could have been numb to it. Their lives probably saw a lot more what we would call trauma nowadays. That was somewhat more commonplace.
Well, it's an excellent point. Death was a much more present part of life than it is now. We're in a unique moment with COVID in which the death toll from the pandemic is quite high, and in ways it's shocking to a lot of people. But for 17th, 18th through the 19th century, death is a constant companion. And so
that's why people had so many damn kids.
Right. And often would name the new kids after the dead kids as kind of an interesting facet, a little tidbit there for your cocktail parties. But yeah, it was
that'll really start a conversation.
Exactly. Let me tell you about this. But yeah, death, I don't know if that would be fair to say that death was stalking people in that period, but death was much more of a present part of their lives, and they expected people to die. Disease, combat, things like that.
Now, speaking
Yeah,
of communication differences, I get the impression our communication now, in terms of not just talking to each other, but countrywide, significantly better than it was back then.
Mm,
Listen,
yes and no.
there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but I'd be willing to bet our communication is a little bit more efficient and clear now.
I think our technology is better.
Yeah.
Technologically, whether or not we're hearing each other, that's the other question.
Yes.
But looking back, with what we know now,
Mhm.
what kind of things do you think we could take from that situation and apply to today?
Yeah, I actually think about this a lot, and the technology aspect has really revolutionized our lives in ways that some are good, some are bad, right? So for example, it would have taken a couple of months for an order from the Secretary at War to reach the generals in North America, the British generals. Now, at that point, these orders could have become irrelevant because the situation on the battlefield had changed. Certainly with Washington communicating with generals and subordinates, they're a closer distance, so they've got more real-time reporting. But the fact that these days we have a computer, we can fire off an email, we can fire off a tweet, and we can do that in a matter of seconds, as opposed to sort of sitting down and thinking about what we actually want to say. That doesn't mean that people in that period weren't sending mean emails or wrote letters that they should not have, and there's some great ones.
Send a nasty pigeon.
Right, send a nasty pigeon, or firing off a missive that they should have thought twice about.
Yeah.
But the act of writing has changed so much, where there is less, I think, contemplation. Doesn't, of course, in a wartime situation, you've got to hurry. But folks like Washington would dedicate parts of their day to sitting down and writing letters.
Mm-hmm.
And we mark off time for email or social media, but not to the extent I think that they did.
They also
So
have
I think
a lot better handwriting.
Right, exactly. So I think that there's a loss of contemplation, unfortunately, as a consequence of our technological revolution. But at the same time, they still found ways to leave that mean comment on their version of YouTube.
I also think, though, that made you have more. You probably took a little bit more into deciding who your generals were, right? Like nowadays, your quote unquote generals, you probably don't have to think as much about, because, I can just correct them immediately. When then I can't correct him for months. So he better be really good at his job.
Right. Well, and it was also complicated by the fact on both sides that you had people of status, people of privilege, who thought that they deserved to be in positions of authority, but deserved to be generals. Horatio Gates, Charles Lee, both had served in the British Army, eventually served in the American Army. They thought, well, I've got military experience. Clearly, I should be a general. Lafayette, all these French officers keep coming over with commissions from Silas Deane, who is negotiating with France on behalf of the Americans. And they keep showing up in Washington's just like, why? Where are you getting these commissions? I can't make you all generals, for God's sake. And then certainly in the British case, where aristocracy is much more powerful and much more of a thing, there are people who are politically well connected, who come from the best families, who've worked their way up through the ranks, so to speak, in terms of waiting their turn to become a general. And a lot of these guys are also members of parliament, so that's something as well. And the British never really find the right combination of generals, and there's always a tension between their civilian overlords and them, because they want status and recognition. They're competing with each other. And the Americans do too. But then that 3,000-mile gap just exacerbates the tension between the British government and their generals. A story named Kevin Weddell has written a new book on the Saratoga campaign called The Complete Victory. He does a wonderful job of really laying this out and explaining how personality conflicts in 3,000 miles caused a hell of a lot of problems for the British, and led to that defeat that was so consequential for the Americans.
Well, it also makes you wonder, when we were going back to Parliament with things that we wanted, where the king would veto. I mean, what was the turnaround on that? 6 months?
Could be, depending on sailing conditions. Yeah.
Well, even then, when it got to his desk, quote unquote,
yeah,
would he look at it immediately?
Yeah, I mean, what would happen is it would go to the Privy Council, his advisors, they would evaluate it, they'd make a recommendation. You could always override them. a thing we have to remember is the monarch in this period has a lot more power than the current monarch. The Elizabeth II is a head of state, but in some ways a figurehead. King George III
Absolutely.
is a monarch in that kind of transition period, but he still enjoys an enormous amount of power, and he can vote up or down any way he damn well pleases.
Well, before we wrap it up, I have one question I think could be an interesting take. Grizz has heard me say this many times, and he just rolls his eyes. But
Oh, God.
so you
I have a
study
feeling I know where this is going.
you study a time in history where power was kind of fracturing and restructuring into, at the time, smaller groups. So going forward, what are your thoughts on the concept of a single world government? And it sounds conspiratorial. I'm not talking about the Bilderberg group.
It's that's what Gene Roddenberry envisioned for Star Trek, right?
Yeah, so Star Trek seems like a good goal, but I don't think we'll make it that far.
No, I think what we'll need is first contact by the Vulcans to unite humanity in ways that never have before.
That's what I say.
And so we need to build a warp drive so that we get noticed. But I think I wouldn't say that there's not, at least in my lifetime, a potential for that kind of unified government. I think we'll probably see a continuation of the UN model, sort of a global deliberative body that has some power, but only as much power as the member states are willing to give it.
Right.
And the UN Security Council is controlled by the 5 permanent members who have absolute veto power over anything. So that makes it really hard to get stuff done. So I don't see anything anytime soon where we'll see a kind of global government.
So we need that common space enemy first.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. There's a common space.
We're a tribe. Right now, we still have to butt heads with each other. If we don't have someone that we can come together to butt heads against, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's and that's always the aliens is always the one to go, right. And then we face an extinction level event.
Could be humans.
Could be humans. It could be a self-inflicted wound that we need to fight against. But it is a fascinating exercise. Like, what would force us as a species to at least temporarily put aside our differences for a kind of greater good? Maybe it's aliens. Maybe it's climate change. Maybe it's something that's on the horizon that we haven't seen yet. I don't know. It would be nice if we stopped doing dumb things and actually pursued something. But in conflict, unfortunately, there are interesting stories that come out of it.
No, more in line with what we were talking about, and maybe more of an exercise for you. Do you find yourself comparing the Revolutionary War to some of the things you're seeing nowadays?
You can see elements, right? So that resistance to central government, although I don't know if it's central government as opposed to the political philosophy of those in power. I see actually much more in common with the late antebellum, so the pre-Civil War period, when you saw Bleeding Kansas, you saw conflicts between free states and slave states over the direction of the country, of this notion that there is a conspiracy, right? That there was this notion in the North of a slave conspiracy or a slave power conspiracy that was attempting to subvert the democratic government. Same thing on the other side, right? The slave oligarchs thought that the North was trying to infringe on their rights and use the federal government to extinguish their property rights. So I see a lot more of that. There's always this notion that there's a paranoid style of American politics. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But unfortunately, I see a lot more similarities to the time the nation tore itself apart than I see in its independence period.
Agreed.
Well, for people who want to find out more about the independence period, where can our guests find information about that regarding you?
Regarding me, you can find me at my website, which is jamespambuske.com, AMBUSKE, for those who are interested. Also at James P. Ambuske on Twitter. And for some of the topics we've talked about, including the Revolutionary War era and the enslaved community at Mount Vernon, We actually have just released in the last month or last couple of months a new podcast called Intertwined, the Enslaved Community at George Washington's Mount Vernon. It's an 8-part series that uses biographical portraits to tell the story of slavery at Mount Vernon, the enslaved community here, slavery in general in the United States, and also the Washingtons' relationship to it. And you can find that by going to georgewashingtonpodcast.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll send people there, put the links up on our episode, and thank you for being on the show. It was a very informative conversation for me.
Well, thank you. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm glad to be a bastard now, I guess.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Well, Grizz, now I'm painfully aware just how much I didn't know about my own American history.
That's the Connecticut school system for you.
Well, you might be able to say that. We rank pretty high in the country, but
Yeah.
I can tell you,
fucking matters.
I can tell you that a lot of the stuff that Jim told us about, I had never even heard of.
Even if you never heard of it, you probably just never thought of it.
Yeah.
We went into a lot of details that kind of the minutia of daily life.
Oh yeah,
I never thought about before.
and you know what came up that it kind of caught me by surprise was when you think about American slavery, I don't really think back to colonial America, which I guess, that's most of it.
I would say that's when I go back to.
So I think of like after the Revolutionary War. So maybe we'll say like 1800 and 1900. That to me, that's the time period of
pre-Civil
slavery.
War.
Yeah. So I wonder how many of the listeners also kind of had that viewpoint where they don't really think back to the colonies, because you think, the colonies, they're building everything up, and you don't really equate it to slavery, because actually, when they taught me slavery in high school, if they did mention it in that time frame, it was incredibly quick and glossed over.
I mean, it's pretty much. It still happens today, so I can't even say that it was pre-Civil War. I mean, slavery is a fucked up thing, and it still goes on.
Yeah. But yeah, there was a lot of wild stuff that I had no idea about.
Now Jerry needs to go read some books and watch some movies.
Yeah, I'll be binging documentaries for the next year.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. Government of laws, not of men.
And remember, a democracy never lasts long.